Hello and welcome to our third video lesson. Today we are talking all about Little Rock Nine and some other examples of youth-led activism during the civil rights movement. So the topics we're going to cover in this video: the event of Little Rock Nine. We'll talk about sit-ins, which is a protest strategy that is nonviolent. We'll then talk about the Freedom Riders and finish up today with the East LA walkout. So why we're learning this is a super important unit in US history. I think it's really important to know that we don't just have civil rights because of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. They're obviously very important individuals, but there's also a ton of work that young people did and continue to do to change this country. So civil rights was championed by people that look a whole lot like you, which I think is important to remember. So keep in mind, last time we had this had a video, last conversation we had about civil rights, we talked about this theme that exists in this movement, which is, do we change? Do we stop being so racially segregated? Do we try to be a little bit more free and more fair and equal? Or do we try to keep things the same way, or to keep the status quo, which was benefiting mostly white people? So this is a theme we're going to keep going to, and we'll see some examples today of young people taking charge to create the change. So when we left off, we talked about this historic court case called Brown versus Board of Education. And so when we left off, we knew that, public education, public schools could no longer be segregated. So what would then happen, of course, is the mixing of races within the school setting. And so that leads us to this group and this event called Little Rock Nine. So Little Rock Nine is a group of all Black students who integrated their high school, Little Rock High School in Arkansas. So they were the first people, Black people, to integrate their school and to stop segregation. I showed y'all this photo before, right? We talked about how there are these cops in the background. These are National Guard or Army members. And kind of just watching on as this white mob, right, of older, mostly white women, yell at this young woman here. This is Elizabeth Eckford, who is the youngest of the Little Rock Nine. And so because of Brown versus Board of Education, right, there is no more school segregation. And so students like Elizabeth Eckford were the first to integrate. This is a picture of Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus. It's a super strange name. This is the governor of the state, who is giving a speech right now in front of an all-white crowd, right? Confederate flag in the background. And he is promising that he's going to stop these students from entering school, that he, as the governor of the state, is going to hold back these students and not allow them into the building, even though the court has said, hey, you sure did over there. Sorry about that, guys. Hopefully I can edit that one out. Okay, so where we were looking at this slide talking about Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus promising to stop Black students from entering the school. And so he's doing this even though our court says you have to stop segregation of public education. And so because he does this, President Eisenhower steps up. So President Eisenhower, of course, he's the president at the time. He's watching what's going on in Little Rock, Arkansas, and he's seen the governor totally defy and ignore what our court has said. And so Eisenhower sends the U.S. Army in. He sends all of these guys to protect those 9 students. And so this is just such an incredible photograph of, you see the Army members here. They're tasked with not only getting these students to the door, but making sure that they're safe in the building. And in their way is a white mob, right? These are students These are maybe even teachers, maybe administrators. I'm not quite sure, but definitely at least some students standing up, standing in the way um, of these 9 students getting their education. And so, luckily, these U.S. Army guys were there for a year, um, walking these students into the building and safely to classes every single day. Lunch counter sit-ins they're a famous form of protest that actually people still use today. Sit-ins are a way of, it is nonviolent. It's a protest, but no one's getting in your face or breaking anything. It is nonviolent, and it is a way of resisting segregation. And so the way this works in the civil rights movement is young people, like these are college students, I believe, pictured here. They're taking up space in white-only businesses. Again, it's always nonviolent. But the idea here is, this is a business, this is a restaurant that only serves white people. And so these young people come in and they sit down and they ask to order maybe a cup of coffee, or maybe they're ordering lunch today while they work on their schoolwork. And so they'll be told by the business owners and by the waitresses that they don't serve Black people in this restaurant and that they would need to leave. And so a sit-in is just sitting in, taking up the space in the booth and saying, I want to buy a cup of coffee, I want to buy a plate of lunch, and I'm going to stay here until you sell it to me. And so when one person or 2 people do this, the business can kind of ignore them. But when your entire restaurant is filled with potential Black customers, right, sitting down and trying to order a cup of coffee, it's a lot harder to ignore. And so we saw lunch counter sit-ins pop up all around the country, in the South and the North, right, to resist segregation. The Greensboro Four are a very famous example of sit-ins. There were 4 college students who sat in at a store chain called Woolworths, which I don't believe exists anymore, but at the time, it's a big chain in the South. And they did what these guys did, right? They sat, they waited, and they returned the next day, right? It's not just one day, it's not just for a couple hours, but they came back, sat at the counter every day for a long time, right? Waiting to be served, waiting to be allowed to buy a cup of coffee. And so they actually succeeded in getting that store chain to remove its policy, so it would not segregate racially anymore. And so this inspired what's called a boycott. You can kind of see these two folks here have some signs. This one says, "Boycott Woolworths. Lunch counters are segregated in the South, and also help the students in the South, don't buy from them." So boycott is choosing to avoid that business, is choosing not to spend your money in a business, on a business that does things like segregate based on race. And so these lunch counter sit-ins and these boycotts are great examples of nonviolent protests to protest segregation. Next up are the Freedom Riders. So these are mostly Black, but also white civil rights activists who did something quite dangerous. They got on buses together. And together on an integrated bus, they rode that bus down through the South to try to protest the segregation of bus terminals, right? As a way of saying, we're going to be visible. Here's our posters, and we're gonna show that segregation, that desegregation is okay, right? That white and Black people can exist together. Unfortunately, the Freedom Riders were met with a lot of violence that looked like this. Their buses were set on fire with them inside of it. They were met with violence and brutality from police officers, white mobs, and the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, which is a white supremacist hate group that is unfortunately still active in America today. So what would happen to them was they would maybe arrive at the bus station in the South, and waiting for them would be a white mob of Klansmen and angry white people and police officers that would straight up just turn the other way, or even take part in beating up the black bus riders who would try to use a white only restroom. And so unfortunately, they were not treated well, and some of these people died, right, doing this. John Lewis is a very famous civil rights activist, and he was a freedom rider. He's currently a congressman from Georgia. He's been in Congress for many, many years. He marched with Martin Luther King at Selma. He's got an incredible story. So reflecting on the impact of freedom riders, first off, they called so much attention to the violence that was used in the South on the news at night. Right, this would be covered. These activists doing nothing wrong, right? Just showing up in the South and trying to use a bathroom, right, should not warrant somebody to be met with physical violence. So people started to see that more and more. Of course, it challenged the status quo, or the way things were, of segregation, made more people question what we're up to. And eventually they did succeed in helping a law get passed that stopped segregation in the bus terminals. So we'll finish up today with the East LA walkouts. So these are walkouts actually by the Chicano students back in 1968, looking at how unequal the education were in LA schools, so like Los Angeles, California. These students noticed in the same district, right, the schools that were occupied by Chicano students, Mexican American students, had higher dropout rates, much higher class sizes, and very racist staff members. And the students who went to the school right down the street that were majority white did not have these problems. And so students planned this walkout to protest how bad it was getting. I think it's important to remember too, right? There's no social media at this time. So this is grassroots organizing. This is communicating. This is sort of an organic movement that grew. So we're going to finish up by summarizing what we've learned. So giving you guys a lot of information, a lot to think about. I want a high quality summary of your notes in your own words, right? So think through those key things you learned today and write that high quality. I'm not looking for a lot of sentences, so I am looking for quality work. What did you just learn? And then flag me down. Let me check off, stamp, or sticker your choice menu, and you can move on to the next activity.